You are looking at a rifle that should not exist, not because it was secret, not because it was experimental, but because every practical reason to build it pointed somewhere else. And France built it anyway. The FAMAS, short, stubby, magazine sitting behind the trigger. A carry handle that runs the entire length of the top like a piece of structural furniture. It looks like something a prop department designed to signal futuristic military without fully understanding how rifles work. Most people assume France built it because French engineers had figured something out that NATO hadn't. That is the wrong answer. The real answer is stranger, more political, and more expensive than anyone expected. Look at the FAMAS next to any rifle France's NATO allies were carrying in the late 1970s. The American M16A1, conventional layout, magazine in front of the trigger, familiar silhouette recognizable in every war film from that era. The German G3, tall, angular, magazine ahead of the grip, a rifle that looks like a rifle. The Belgian FN-FNC, conventional, balanced, widely adopted across multiple armies with minimal complaints. Now look at the FAMAS again. The magazine is behind the pistol grip. The action is inside the buttstock. The barrel runs nearly the full length of the weapon, but the overall package is shorter than most weapons NATO soldiers were carrying. The carry handle is not a rail accessory. It is not cosmetic, not optional, not a mounting platform for optics. It is load-bearing. It is structural. The receiver passes through it. Remove it, and the weapon stops functioning as a coherent object. This is a bullpup configuration, a layout where the bolt and magazine sit behind the firing hand rather than in front of it. And in 1978, France issued it to its entire army as the standard service rifle. Before Britain had the L85, before any other NATO member had standardized on anything remotely similar. From the outside, it looked like France had leapfrogged everyone. That is not what happened. The bullpup design concept was not new when France adopted it. The British had experimented seriously with it as far back as 1951 with the EM2, a bullpup rifle that actually made it to limited trials before NATO-caliber politics and American pressure effectively killed it. Czechoslovakia had bullpup experiments in development. The Soviet Union had bullpup prototypes sitting in its own design bureaus. The layout had been explored, tested, demonstrated, and set aside multiple times by multiple countries across multiple decades. Not because nobody understood its potential, but because every version came with trade-offs that made fielding it at scale genuinely complicated. A shorter package meant different ergonomics, different training standards, different manual of arms. The trigger in a bullpup has to connect mechanically to a bolt group sitting further back in the receiver, which makes the pull longer, heavier, and significantly harder to refine into something precise. Ejection happens close to the shooter's face, which creates real problems for left-handed users. Maintenance procedures are different. Clearing malfunctions is different. Everything a soldier learns about operating a bullpup has to be unlearned and relearned if they ever transition to a conventional rifle. These were known problems in the 1960s. France knew them when the FAMAS program began, and France built the FAMAS anyway. The question is not whether France was ahead of its time. The question is what France was actually trying to solve, and whether the answer had anything to do with making a better rifle. To understand that, you have to go back further than the rifle itself. Back to the mid-1960s. Back to a political decision that would shape French defense policy for the next half-century and send consequences into every corner of how France equipped and funded its military. In 1966, France, under Charles de Gaulle, withdrew from NATO's integrated military command. Not from the alliance itself. France remained a NATO member, but from the shared command structure that meant French forces could be placed under NATO operational orders in a crisis. This was not a small administrative adjustment. It was a statement, a declaration that France would manage its own defense on its own terms, with its own equipment, its own doctrine, and its own industry. France had already developed its nuclear deterrent independently of the United States. It had built its own aircraft. It had maintained its own armored vehicle programs. The logic applied equally to the rifle in every French soldier's hands. Strategic autonomy required manufacturing autonomy. An army that depended on American rifles, American ammunition, American spare parts, and American supply chains was not a strategically autonomous army. It was a client. And in French strategic thinking at that moment in history, being a client was a form of vulnerability that de Gaulle's entire foreign policy had been constructed to eliminate. This is where the factory becomes central to the story. The Manufacture d'Armes de Saint-Étienne, MAS, was a state-owned arms facility with roots going back centuries. It had produced French military weapons across multiple wars, multiple regimes, multiple generations of soldiers. After World War II, MAS had designed the MAS-49, a semi-automatic rifle that became France's standard infantry arm, specifically because France would not adopt the American M1 Garand or any other foreign design. The choice was deliberate and political. The MAS-49 was French. It was domestically produced. It kept MAS operational, kept the workforce employed, kept the institutional knowledge alive, kept the supply chain inside French borders. For the era, it was a decent rifle. Semi-automatic, reliable enough, chambered in a full-power cartridge that France had standardized on. It served through the late colonial period, through Algeria, through the early Cold War years, when France still had global commitments and the army to match them. By the late 1960s, it was aging. The armies across NATO were moving towards selective fire rifles, chambered in smaller intermediate cartridges, lighter weapons, higher ammunition capacity, faster handling. France needed something new. The options were the same options any military faced at that moment. Buy a proven foreign design and license produce it domestically, or design something genuinely new from scratch. For France, the first option was not really on the table. Buying an American M16, licensing a Belgian FAL, or adopting a German G3 was politically incompatible with everything the de Gaulle doctrine had established, and everything that had followed it. This was not about which rifle grouped tighter at 300 meters. This was about what it meant, symbolically and strategically, for France to put a foreign weapon in every French soldier's hands. So the brief that went to MAS engineers carried an unusual weight. Design a new French rifle. Make it domestically producible with existing French manufacturing capacity. Make it compatible with modern ammunition. And, this is the part that rarely appears in the clean technical histories, make it look like something France had actually invented, not a variation on something NATO already had, not a recognizable derivative, something that announced its own identity. The Bullpup layout delivered on that last requirement in a way no conventional design could have. A Bullpup FAMAS could not be mistaken for an M16. It could not be confused with a G3, or an FAL, or an FNC. Its silhouette was its own. Anyone who saw it in footage or photographs understood immediately that they were looking at something French, something different, something that carried the visual argument that France had approached the problem from a different direction and arrived somewhere nobody else had gone. That argument mattered. The design work began under Paul Telly at MAS in the late 1960s. Years of prototyping, testing, refinement, and institutional negotiation followed. The result was the FAMAS, Fusil d'Assaut de la Manufacture d'Armes de Saint-Étienne. The factory's name is in the weapon's official designation. That is not an accident. The technical case for the Bullpup layout was not entirely manufactured for political convenience. France maintained significant airborne and mechanized forces, and for both of those roles, the Bullpup offered real advantages that conventional rifles could not match without sacrificing barrel length. Paratroopers jumping with a full-length conventional rifle deal, with a package that catches on equipment, complicates movement through aircraft doors, and is genuinely awkward in the seconds immediately after landing, when the soldier needs to transition from jumper to fighter as fast as possible. Vehicle crews, tank crews, infantry fighting vehicle crews, armored personnel carrier passengers, operate in spaces where a full-length conventional rifle is actively inconvenient, something that needs to be managed and stowed and retrieved in confined geometry. A Bullpup with the same barrel length as a conventional rifle, but a substantially shorter overall package, addresses both of those problems simultaneously. The FAMAS achieved a barrel length of approximately 488 millimeters inside a total package of 757 millimeters. A standard M16A1 of the same era achieved a similar barrel length inside a total package approaching 990 millimeters. That difference of more than 200 millimeters is real, and operationally meaningful when you are trying to exit a vehicle hatch under pressure, or clear a doorway, or move through the inside of a building where the rifle's length determines what you can and cannot do. The FAMAS also came standard with something unusual for a standard-issue infantry rifle of its era, a folding bipod, built into the weapon from the factory, issued on every unit. This was not an accessory. This was doctrine. The French Army's intent was to give the FAMAS enough utility as a light support weapon that one platform could replace multiple distinct weapons across infantry formations. The rifleman's weapon and the automatic rifleman's weapon in a single package. One design, one logistics chain, one maintenance standard, one training program. Armies are constantly trying to simplify their equipment lists, and a rifle that could credibly serve in both roles had genuine institutional appeal. The bipod was the visible expression of that ambition. It also added weight that worked against the Bullpup's natural advantage. The FAMAS ended up heavier than several conventional rifles it was theoretically replacing. The simplification argument became more complicated when soldiers had to carry the result. The operating system the FAMAS used compounded the difficulty. Most assault rifles of the era used gas operation. Propellant gas is tapped from the barrel after the bullet passes a port. The gas pressure cycles the bolt rearward, extracts and ejects the spent case, and chambers the next round from the magazine. The FAMAS used a lever-delayed blowback system. Lever-delayed blowback uses mechanical resistance inside the receiver, a pair of levers that must rotate out of engagement before the bolt can travel rearward, to slow the bolt's movement and control the extraction timing without relying on gas tapping. The system worked. The FAMAS cycled reliably under most conditions. But it was calibrated and tuned around French military ammunition, and that calibration became a problem the moment NATO began standardizing on the SS-109 projectile, a 5.56mm load with different pressure characteristics than what the FAMAS's system had been optimized for. The original FAMAS F1 had documented extraction issues with SS-109 ammunition under certain conditions. Case head separation, failures to extract, malfunctions that were not catastrophic but were real and repeatable. This was not internet speculation. It was documented in enough operational contexts to drive an official development program that produced the FAMAS G2, a revised version with a modified chamber and updated feed geometry specifically to address the SS-109 compatibility problem. The G2 entered service in 1995. The original FAMAS F1 had been the standard service rifle since 1978. The fix arrived 17 years after the problem was identified in service. The magazine situation was its own category of difficulty. The original FAMAS F1 used proprietary 25-round magazines that were not compatible with STANAG specifications, the standardized magazine format that most NATO rifles were converging on. In peacetime, in French garrisons, firing French ammunition from French magazines maintained by French armorers, this was a manageable inconvenience. In coalition operations, it was something harder to manage. If a French soldier runs out of ammunition alongside American, British, or German soldiers in a combined operation, he cannot take magazines from his allies. Their magazines do not fit his rifle. The logistics chain that supplies his specific magazines has to remain intact in an environment where logistics chains frequently do not remain intact. This was a known limitation when the FAMAS F1 entered service. It was accepted because the alternative, redesigning the weapon to accept STANAG magazines, meant additional engineering investment, additional delay, and an admission that the original design had shipped with a significant operational gap. The Gulf War in 1991 placed French forces into one of the largest coalition operations since the Second World War, operating alongside American, British, Arab, and other coalition forces, all carrying STANAG-compatible weapons. The FAMAS F1 magazines stood out in a way that was no longer theoretical. The FAMAS G2 addressed this with STANAG compatibility as part of its revision package. But the G2 was fielded selectively. French Navy commandos and certain special units received it in meaningful numbers, but the bulk of the regular French army continued carrying F1 variants. The fix existed. It was not universally distributed. The trigger was the complaint that never fully went away, across the entire service life of the platform. Bullpup triggers are mechanically disadvantaged by the geometry of the design. The trigger shoe that the shooter's finger contacts is located physically far from the sear that releases the firing mechanism. That distance requires mechanical linkage, rods, levers, pivot points, and every connection in that chain introduces friction, play, and inconsistency into what the shooter feels at the trigger finger. The sensation is typically described as heavy, with a long travel and an indistinct breakpoint. The FAMAS trigger received this criticism consistently from soldiers who carried it, from evaluators who tested it, and from instructors who trained with it. The complaints were not about a dangerous malfunction or a weapon that failed to fire. The complaints were about precision, about the fact that at ranges where trigger quality begins to matter, the FAMAS trigger was making the job harder than it needed to be. For soldiers who trained on the FAMAS from the start and had no comparison point, it was simply the baseline. This is how rifles work. For soldiers who had fired other platforms, the comparison was unfavorable in a way that was difficult to ignore. French Special Operations Forces, with access to a wider range of weapons through training relationships with Allied units and the operational requirements of their missions, developed preferences for other platforms earlier than the conventional army. The preference was documented. The complaints were recorded. The FAMAS architecture made a genuinely excellent trigger pull, functionally impossible to engineer without rebuilding the operating system from the ground up. The geometry that created the problem was the geometry of the weapon. There was no patch. Through all of this, the ammunition sensitivity of the original system, the proprietary magazine format, the trigger characteristics, the bipod weight, the ergonomic trade-offs of the Bullpup layout on a platform that was not optimized for accessory integration, the FAMAS remained France's standard rifle. It went to Lebanon in the early 1980s, when French forces were part of the multinational force trying to stabilize a country coming apart. It went to Chad, across multiple French military interventions spanning years. It served in Bosnia during the peacekeeping operations of the 1990s. It went to Afghanistan as part of the NATO coalition operation. It served across the full range of French military activity in Africa, in the Sahel, in Ivory Coast, in the Central African Republic, in Mali, across 3 decades of operations that ranged from conventional to counterinsurgency to peacekeeping to direct action. French Foreign Legion units carried it. Conventional army units carried it. It appeared in enough operational environments and enough genuine combat that its silhouette became something more than a design choice. It became a record. The weapon that was partly chosen because it looked distinctive became genuinely recognizable because it had been carried into real situations by real soldiers and had come back with them. The visual identity accumulated weight from the service history. The complaints were real, and the record was also real. The FAMAS functioned. It performed its basic function across conditions that ranged from European exercises to African dust to Afghan mountains. That is not a minor thing. A rifle that does not work does not last 3 decades in service with an army that fights. The FAMAS lasted because it worked well enough, and because what it represented, institutionally and politically, made replacement harder to justify than continuation. The institutional momentum that kept the FAMAS in service across its entire life cycle is worth examining directly, because it explains something about how armies actually make decisions about equipment that popular narratives tend to simplify. Replacing a standard service rifle is not a procurement decision. It is simultaneously a logistics decision, a training decision, a budget decision, a manufacturing decision, and a political decision. And all of those decisions have to align before the replacement actually happens. Every soldier who has trained on the FAMAS and built muscle memory around its manual of arms needs to retrain on the new platform. Every armorer who maintains FAMAS rifles needs new technical training and new tools. Every spare part in the supply system needs to be replaced or supplemented. Contracts with domestic manufacturers need to be renegotiated or terminated. The political cost of acknowledging that the original design had shipped with significant limitations that took decades to partially address compounds all of it. It was easier to field the G2 selectively, designated an improvement rather than an admission, and defer the full replacement decision until the operational pressure became impossible to manage within the existing platform. That pressure arrived through the sustained operational tempo of the 2000s and 2010s. French forces were operating in coalition environments almost continuously. The Sahel operations in particular, in Mali, in the broader Sahel region under Operation Barkhane, placed French soldiers in conditions, and alongside allies, in ways that exposed every limitation the FAMAS carried, in an environment where those limitations had consequences. The rifle functioned, but the margins were tighter. The logistics complexity was more consequential when operating far from established supply lines. The ergonomic limitations mattered more when soldiers were carrying full modern load-bearing equipment, mounting optics and lights and foregrips on a platform whose carry handle and receiver geometry made accessory integration awkward in ways that conventional rifles with integrated rail systems did not. Soldiers adapted, as they always do. Adaptation has costs in time, in training, in field modifications that work around the platform's limitations rather than through them. The French military eventually made the decision that every practical signal had pointed toward for years. The HK416F, designed by Heckler & Koch, a German company, became France's new standard service rifle. Conventional layout, gas-operated, Stand-Nag compatible, Picatinny rails, integrated from the factory. Ergonomics designed for modern kit and modern operational requirements. Deliveries proceeded through the late 2010s. The FAMAS was retired from frontline service by a foreign weapon. A German weapon. The exact outcome that the entire FAMAS program, the political decision, the industrial investment, the decades of carrying a rifle with known limitations rather than buying someone else's, had been constructed to prevent. That irony is not a footnote, it is the conclusion. The FAMAS existed because France decided it would field a domestic rifle rather than buy a foreign one, and it accepted the costs of that decision for decades because the alternative was admitting that the original logic had limits the operational record had eventually exposed. The political case and the performance case had pointed in opposite directions long enough that performance finally determined the outcome. What remained after the replacement was the silhouette. That short, handle-forward, magazine behind the trigger shape that had appeared in footage and photographs and news reports and games and films across 4 decades of operational service. It looked like France had done something genuinely different. It had. The difference just was not primarily technical. When you see the FAMAS in old footage, French soldiers in Beirut, in N'Djamena, in Sarajevo, in Kabul, you are looking at a weapon that was built to prove something. The Bullpup layout was real engineering, applied by real engineers to a real platform that served in real operations across 3 decades. The trade-offs were equally real, documented by the soldiers and units that carried the rifle through conditions that had no interest in the political reasoning behind the procurement decision. The decision to build it domestic, build it visually distinct, build it French rather than practical, was made by people who understood exactly what they were choosing to trade away. They traded Stand-Nag compatibility. They traded trigger precision. They traded ammunition universality. They traded the ability to say, without qualification, that France had simply selected the best available option for its soldiers. In return, they got a rifle that no one could mistake for anyone else's. They got a domestic manufacturing base that stayed alive and employed for another generation. They got the ability to say, in 1978, that France had fielded a next-generation rifle before any comparable NATO army had standardized on anything like it. And they got decades of operational service that, whatever its limitations, was real service. Real soldiers, real missions, real environments, real results. The FAMAS looks like the future. It always did. That was part of the point. It looks like someone solved the rifle problem from a completely different direction and arrived somewhere nobody else was willing to go. And there is something true in that appearance. France did approach the problem differently, and it did arrive somewhere nobody else went. What the silhouette does not show, and what the service history gradually made visible, is that the direction France chose was shaped as much by what it refused to accept as by what it was trying to achieve. The FAMAS is a rifle built around a refusal. Refusal to buy American, refusal to adopt German, refusal to admit that strategic autonomy and optimal soldier equipment might sometimes point in different directions. The rifle carried that refusal into every theater it served in, And it carried it well enough that the refusal lasted for 37 years before the operational reality of modern coalition warfare finally made it unsustainable. If you found this breakdown useful, the kind of military history that goes past the surface and into the actual reasoning behind the decisions, subscribe. Every video on this channel follows the same logic. One strange detail, one real question, one practical answer that takes the whole story apart and shows you what was actually driving it. The next one is already waiting.